So it's kind of weird that we're talking about this guy one day before Thanksgiving because
Well, I mean, he's a Death-Persuader. I guess he's not very thankful for life. I don't know. Where are you where are you going with this joke?
that was an interesting angle you were taking it down. I was thinking more like, everybody's sitting around, gorging themselves on food while this guy is,
Oh,
starving himself to death in the name of philosophy.
right.
But that works too.
Um, well, that's the other thing though. So maybe that's a good way to introduce the main thrust. So we're talking about Hegesias and the school of Hegesians, I guess they call them. Very small like subsection of the Cyrenaics that did not last very long, like maybe like four generations. And it's a kind of school of hedonism that ends up trying to take hedonism to its furthest limits.
Yeah, well, last night you were talking about how it kind of took hedonism to its logical conclusion, and I guess that's kind of the open question is like, is the logical conclusion of hedonism starving yourself to death? And like that might sound like a weird question to people who like when they think of hedonism, they think, well, why would a hedonism starve themselves to death? They're all about pleasure, and that doesn't sound very pleasurable. But this guy, I guess, had a different view of things.
Yeah. So basically, a hedonist is someone who thinks the value in life, the good in life, is primarily derived from pleasure. So if you might think, right, it's kind of counterintuitive. Oh, pleasure is good and it's easy to get pleasure, right? We eat, we sleep, we have sex, we do drugs, go dancing, not it's not a terribly high bar for accessibility. It makes the good life accessible to many people. But there's kind of a dark, gloomy side to it too. And we can kind of think why someone like Hegesias would be drawn towards this conclusion of we should end ourselves if pleasure is the main value. And I guess the reason he goes there is that he has two conflicting kind of premises. He has the hedonist principle that pleasure is the good. But then he has this other principle that that good is unattainable um for us to achieve continuously over time, right?
And that good that he thinks is unachievable, is that like, because like when I think of hedonism, my reading of hedonist philosophy is pretty limited, and like really the main guy that comes to mind for me is Epicurus.
Mm-hmm.
So like, is is this sort of good that Hegesias thinks is unattainable the same good that Epicurus thought was attainable, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so the reason why Hegesias has a more gloomy outlook is because Epicurus thinks that the lack of pain is also a pleasure. So not only are positive pleasures good, like eating, like getting a good massage, but also just not being in a like experience of serious pain or trauma or something is also good. So when Hegesias goes to do it, he separates the two. He says pleasure and pain are different, and pleasure is much more hard to achieve. Like a lack of pleasure isn't, or sorry, a lack of pain isn't pleasure. It's just not having pleasure. And so once you accept that, then you have this kind of think about have you been into antinatalism arguments at all?
I mean, it's the sort of thing you run into now and again in the world of Discord philosophy. but it's not something that I've ever studied on like the academic side of it, I guess.
So the this also comes from a kind of hedonist argument, but they have that square and they try to show that not living at all is neutral. And so it's the best from a utilitarian, like hedonist kind of calculus,
Hmm.
because you have no chance of pain and you have no chance of pleasure. Um, but because there's no chance for having pain, it's best just to never be born at all, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I've definitely gotten into that with Schopenhauer, looking into like world as will and representation, talking about how like if you scan like somebody's whole life, you know, they will probably end up experiencing more pain than they will pleasure. Or I guess maybe he talks about it in terms of happiness more. Um, but he even says he even takes it as far as saying like even if you only experienced happiness like at every moment of your life, which no one does, but he's saying even in that most optimal situation, at the end of it, you're still gonna die. So while he's claimed not to endorse suicide, he was attracted to ascetics. He loved guys that would sit around and eat like one bean every 12 years or whatever, and like expose themselves to the elements. So like I could see Schopenhauer getting down with someone like Hegesias.
well, Schopenhauer was, yeah, so I'm glad you brought him up because I think he's a really good example of what I'm talking about. Because the idea is that, like, um, the kind of pleasures we experience are very weak and ephemeral, whereas pains are very strong and long lasting and more easy to come by. And a lot of the things that we take as pleasures are kind of just like mitigations of pain. Like, we eat a good meal. It's like all you're doing is mitigating the pain of hunger. You're not really adding much to your life, I think is what.
Yeah, kind of like when you're after smoking cigarettes for years, you're never really going to get that feeling that you got when that you smoked that first bogey.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is where these kind of arguments are coming from. And I guess for the purpose of this discussion, I'm interested in like why people are drawn to that or
Mm.
why that why would you want that to be your ideology, even if it's true. And I guess if it is true, that's a separate question.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about this because like asceticism and I mean I'm using that term very broadly to encompass not just like religious asceticism, but also like philosophical asceticism. And what I mean by that in either case is like this radical self-denial. I mean, we could distinguish philosophical and religious asceticism based on what's motivating someone to do that. Um, but I wonder if there's also some overlap between the two, and in terms of why someone might be attracted to a secular or religious asceticism or some combination of the two. Um, I think that I think that if we just leave aside the more like spiritual motivations, which is like, okay, I want to get close to God, so I want to strip away all the things that are kind of bound up with being human, and that's going to of course have anything to do with like basic needs, basic survival needs like food, clothing, shelter. That's why you see monastics, like extreme ascetics, I guess, you know not wearing many clothes, not eating very much, and living out in the woods. um as but if we take away like those spiritual motivations, one of the kind of like hypotheses I've had for a while of why people are attracted to things like um like the breatharians, or this idea that you can avoid eating altogether and just subsist by breathing, which some people have died doing, unsurprisingly. like I wonder if a lot of this is motivated by this idea that like what you consume is like one of the most basic things that you have control over. And maybe it stems from a desire for like a radical degree of control over this basic aspect of life.
Yeah, I'm of two minds on that. So I think that's a good explanation, right? Like, you feel like your whole life is out of your control and you experience all this pain from outside sources. And so if you're the one that can administer the pain and you're the one that can kind of subsume that kind of regularity of suffering that you experience and turn it into something in your power, maybe that gives you some kind of sense of control and meaning to your life that overrides the negative sensations that come from that. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it works like it works in like both extremes. Like you could have someone that is, overeating. So it can go in like you could have someone that's eating too much or someone that's not eating enough. You even see that in like I don't know, this theme of like going from one extreme to the other is interesting to me. Like, because you can even see that in people that go from being addicted to drugs to being addicted to, I don't know if this makes sense, but being addicted to not doing drugs, you know, not doing drugs or not smoking or not drinking or not indulging yourself sexually, which you see with like the no fap stuff, like it becomes like I don't know, I feel like there's a very deep connection between a lot of this self-improvement stuff, which I don't think is harmful in and of itself, but I think a lot of it might be motivated by um, some some feeling of not being in control. And maybe those examples kind of go to show that maybe a need for control over some parts of your life isn't necessarily a bad thing, because that could lead someone to make positive changes in their life, I guess. So that might be another open question is like,
Okay.
while we obviously don't want to go to the extreme that Hegesias did of starving ourselves to death,
Hmm.
um, you know, if you don't try to exert any control over your appetites, your impulses, then we would basically be living out sort of the caricature of hedonism, which is the idea that I think a lot of people have in their minds when they think of hedonism, which is people just sort of going around doing whatever they want all the time.
So yeah, that's a lot to take in. I just got
Sorry.
overwhelmed with thoughts. So what you're saying to me, so now I'm kind of thinking on a few different levels. One is that maybe a lot of this can be explained as like ritual,
Mm,
like it's almost like you perform the right actions in the right order, and then so it gives you some kind of magical power over the situation, even though you might not be describing it that as such. It kind of seems like this kind of thinking is magical thinking, right? Like, oh, if I whip myself 30 times, I'll go to heaven. I'll have control over the situation.
yeah. Yeah, I think it could definitely be described as a kind of magic that people are looking for.
Mm-hmm. And then I want to say that with Hegesias and maybe like the um antinatalist kind of arguments, I don't think it's necessarily magic though. I wonder if it's more coming from a rational place where it's like, I believe that this thing is the good. It's the only good that we can ever feel. But my just lived experience has shown me that it's not possible to achieve it. So it's better to die. That seems more like a rational argument to me. That doesn't seem like magical thinking.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think it's important to draw that distinction too, because it's one thing to say that people are motivated to follow certain practices by some, I guess, non-doxastic factor, like some factor that has nothing to do with what they believe, but rather with
Mm-hmm.
something that they want. And it's actually kind of ironic now that I'm thinking about it, because this is something that really annoys me about a lot of the explanations people give for why people join cults. They almost always explain them in terms like I was describing just a moment ago, in these non-doxastic terms. Not to say that there aren't beliefs kind of underpinning those things. Like there's, a belief in an afterlife might motivate someone, to perform certain rituals. But like at the end of the day, I think it's very different from saying like I just want control over my life versus, look, I've thought about this rationally and this is the conclusion I've arrived at. I
Yeah.
did what the philosophers told me to do. I examined my life, and now I'm ready to starve myself.
So maybe the ritual though gets pushed back to the examining phase because maybe that's the ritual.
What do you mean?
Like maybe the examining yourself and putting all these ideas to the test, that is the ritual. That is the thing that makes you feel like you have more control over your life.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder because I as much as I love philosophy and I try to be rationalist as I can, I do think that there's some element of social construction and ritual behind it, voodoo behind it. You know what I mean?
Well, could you expand on that a little bit more, I guess?
Because like, you know, if I took philosophy from the most rationalist perspective I could very easily see myself being argued into something like moral anti-realism and just rejecting what everyone says because it doesn't fit like this narrow view of science and knowledge that we might have.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about philosophy to me isn't like that like narrow pursuit of like, oh, I have like 90% certainty that these things are true and 70 about these, and so I'm going to construct my life around the most probable, accurate, like pragmatic thing to do. That's not what's interesting to me. What's interesting to me is like there's these wide variety of ideas that we can examine and apply different types of reasoning to and explore things in different ways and draw from all these different elements, not just like this narrow empirical science that's maybe like 100 years old. Um, that's not what draws me to it. But then the side that does to me starts with the kind of mystical ritualistic side where it's like know thyself, examine everything, have conceptions that are constantly reevaluate. Like these are not um what's the word? These are not descriptive statements. These are normative principles that we're saying when we say these things. So to me, that starts to get into the realm of ritual.
And you're saying these normative statements precede descriptions, like the normative statement to know thyself necessarily precedes like a description of what what thyself is, I guess. I know that that didn't come out in like English at all, but you know what I mean.
Well, like the way you described it, I think captured it right. Like you said, oh, Hegesias did this like examination of himself and realized that he can't achieve the good. But that examination part, that's kind of like the ritual part. Cause like what does that entail?
Yeah, and well, do you think that there's some degree of contingency in terms of what examining oneself can actually produce? Like, obviously, not everyone who examines themselves comes away with the view that they need to starve themselves to death. But this guy did, and some of his followers did.
Well, like the way you described it, I think captured it right. Like you said, oh, Hegesias did this like examination of himself and realized that he can't achieve the good. But that examination part, that's kind of like the ritual part. Cause like what does that entail?
Like maybe in the self-examination, he came up with these ideas that, you know, if he's committed to like I'm going to be a rational person, I'm going to be a good philosopher, and I'm going to do everything based on logic, it's kind of like you plug certain things in, and then whatever the computer pops out, you're kind of committing to like, I'm going to go with whatever this process of applying rational thought and self-examination is going to yield, and as far as why it yielded for him that he should be a hedonist and that he should express his hedonism in this particular way, I don't know if anyone has the answer to that, but I'm of the mind, and it's not even like I said at the beginning, I don't want to dismiss that, because then it kind of goes to this other problem of like completely ignoring contributory factors. Like, could it be possible that someone, was really depressed and just hated life, and they found this Hegesias guy and they were like, well, here's like a socially acceptable way to bring an end to my life. Like, I can bring about an end to my life with a group of other people that are doing the same thing, and I'll go down in history as, a great philosopher. I don't know to what extent they expected their school of thought to catch on, but that could have played a part in it too. So I don't want to completely dismiss that. It's just I don't I don't like the idea of stopping there.
I see what you're saying. Like, it's just very hard to pinpoint the thing that makes them do the act and whether it's the ideology. It seems more like both of us are weighing more towards the ideology than towards the like mental state. But
I think
you're
so, yeah.
you're kind of saying like we don't want to dismiss the mental state, even though we might think the ideology does kind of make them take the final step.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same reason that like, people I think are correct to be careful about how they talk about, these kinds of things. Cause like, like I guess maybe I don't know. Do you think it's realistic to say that like someone who's depressed today, picks up Diogenes Laertes as you know,
Well, maybe not him, but they totally could. I mean, the way I found about Hegasi is I listened to a podcast on the history of philosophy, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard about that aspect of the Cyrenaics before."
Yeah, I had never heard of him at all until you brought him up. And I was even looking in my, I have AC Grayling's History of Philosophy, which is great. Um, does not have a section on Hegesias, though.
Yeah, and I think part that's just because history did him injustice and his work was not preserved. So
So he did write stuff, you're saying?
yeah, Cicero says he wrote the book on what was it called? On the benefit of starvation or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't have the my notes right in front of me. But something, yeah, it was something on that, like the benefits of starvation. um so he had works, they didn't get preserved, and I mean, I could see why. Like,
Well, there was kind of a panic around him, at least according to Cicero's accounts, that like that Hegesias was banned from the city or something
yeah,
for.
like definitely in like those kind of repressive early societies where they could control things like that, I don't see why they wouldn't destroy his work, honestly.
So like, what if somebody came out um today and was like, hey, I wrote this book, the, benefits of starvation.
Well, we have an
Like,
example of that. We have Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther,
hmm,
right?
okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
So he wrote this book about a young man who falls in love with a woman. She rejects him, basically. Or I don't know if she rejects him, so to speak, but she marries someone else. And he writes this beautiful letter about why you should kill yourself if you don't get what you want. And then he does it, and it inspired a wave of suicides in Europe in like the 19th century.
Wow.
We have a modern example of that.
I was even thinking of like literally like today, but I didn't even, but that's surprising. I didn't know anything about that. I mean, I know Gerda, but not like beyond Faust. I don't really know
Oh,
anything.
okay, that's interesting to know about that. Yeah, you should look into it.
I was thinking about like as far as like very contemporary examples, like do you know the breatharians?
No.
So the breatharians, I think Atrocity Guide was the channel that did a documentary about them. They're basically it's like a new age thing. And yeah, they believe that it's possible to subsist entirely on breath. Like they breathe in, I don't know, the life energy of the sun or something like that. And they've had people that would like, host these courses online and stuff. And, it's one of those like cyber sect things where like a lot of this gets disseminated on the internet. And they had people, I don't know what the exact number is, but they've had people that have literally have starved to death doing this. And one of the worst parts about it is that I think a couple of like the main proponents of this belief system were later discovered to be frauds. Like they had like fully stocked fridges of food, and then they're getting online and saying like, yeah, you can survive without drinking or eating ever again. You just have to breathe. Like, and then they would find out like, well, why is there a steak in your refrigerator? You know?
But this is kind of like a whole other angle though, because this is like this isn't really like, okay, I'm inspired by ideology, and this isn't like ritual. I don't know if you have to even be depressed. You kind of it's almost because I imagine a lot of the people that fall for this are just like young people.
Yeah, I don't know about that one way or the other.
Okay.
I'd have to look into that, but that's a good question. I mean, are you talking, I mean, the antinatalism thing seems very popular amongst young people.
The antinatalism makes sense to because like there's a lot of reasons to be antinatalist aside from just making that pleasure chart and deciding that not to live is the best. Like we live in the time period where people are legitimately afraid of the future, and it's harder to live with a child, I think, than it has been in the past. So I wonder, like that to me can be explained by like purely social terms. But like breatharianism cannot. You know what I mean?
Well, that's an interesting direction too, because it's like, so on the one hand, we were kind of, kind of wading through this question of like, how does Hegesias take hedonism to this extreme conclusion? Um, and for thinking about the antinatalism movement, I'm thinking about it in the opposite direction of like, how does the belief in antinatalism not go to this extreme conclusion? Like, in terms of like, I know someone can be an antinatalist and say, like, I don't want to have children myself. But if your view is that life is, mostly sucks, like, and I maybe there are people that have taken it to this extreme conclusion. Um, I guess do you think that kind of challenges this idea that beginning with a particular ideological position will have this sort of extreme result if you take it to the end of it?
Oh, I mean, I guess because like to me, when you have ideology, there's two kind of components. You have the ideology itself, and then you have the motivation. And I
Mm.
don't know, I guess maybe I misspoke earlier, or maybe I put it too strongly about how far the ideology is working. But I mean I just don't see ideology as providing like a super strong motivational factor. Like I might believe, like I'm vegan. So and but that itself doesn't provide me a lot of motivation to like do vegan things. Like I might think it's right to not eat meat. And there's plenty of people like this that you encounter, right?
Hmm.
They'll be like, I don't believe we should eat meat, but I do it anyways because I don't have the motivation to not do it, right? And if you counted all those people, I think you'd have more vegetarian vegans maybe than not even. But so I think it's kind of like that, right? Like it's like, okay, I'm like like for me in my head, I'm an antinatalist, but I have no motivation to promote it in any way. Like I don't want kids. I'm not trying to have kids. Um, but I think it's the least thing I'm worried about right now is trying to make other people not have kids. Like you're gonna fight an uphill battle against the worst, like kind of instinct that we have, which is just to procreate for no reason. So like
Yeah.
I don't have any like mental motivation or like feeling to fight against that in my
Well,
mind.
you're kind of talking about like it's there's kind of this broader context I think behind what you're talking about, which is that sort of people take these very extreme views, and I'm not saying extreme necessarily in a negative sense in
Mhm.
this context, just that it's radical, you know, in like the strict sense of the word. People sort of take these radical positions and then go on the internet and sort of make their whole identity about being the anti-natalist guy, you know, or
Yeah.
the yeah, you were kind of talking about it earlier too, like certain like very niche positions in philosophy that are guaranteed to irritate a lot of people, whether rightly or wrongly. And I wonder how much of that you think is motivated by just purely the desire to be that guy, you know, that or that person that has this extreme view, you know, and that's sort of that's my little badge that I wear, you know.
Yeah, that's a whole other question too, because then you have to like then you have to separate because there's the leader, there's like the anti-natalist or the anti-realist leader who kind of like propagates the information and does all the groundwork. And then there's all the followers who it doesn't seem like they're really trying to get much attention from being anti-natalist, but then they or anti-realist or whatever anti thing, then they want to like benefit from being in this community in some way. So I think we have to look at those motivations as separate too.
The desire to be part of a community, but also the desire to have kind of a view that is almost guaranteed to push you out of mainstream society.
Yeah, because like the leaders seem to be like it's like they want to be recognized and they want to be accepted as an authority figure, but they can't because their view is somehow not acceptable. Whereas the people that are following it, I think they're looking for something different. They're looking for like, I feel like an outsider in all my other communities. And in this community, I can be an insider to this like taboo knowledge of some sort.
But some of these people, they seem to get off on the negative reactions they get. It's almost like the negative reaction they get actually validates the belief system.
Oh yeah, it's like what you're talking about, the epistemic defense mechanism.
I think that's related, but I feel like it's somewhat distinct. Like an epistemic defense mechanism is basically like I come up with this concept that's baked into my belief system that is supposed to explain why people doubt what I'm saying. So like in the you know like in the Bible's the Mark of the Beast group, they would say like if you doubt what they're saying, it's because like the devil is brainwashing you or something. You know, I mean every like all these kind of sects do this. You know, like Applewhite would do the same thing. He would say like if you don't believe what I'm saying, it's because you didn't receive a soul deposit from the next level, which would allow you to decode the messages I'm giving you.
Right.
You know, and it's like, well, how convenient, you know?
So then, but what you're saying with the other thing is that like they're looking for that controversy.
Yeah, I think so.
Even though they try to explain it away, they're also they wouldn't exist if they didn't have people disagreeing with them.
Yeah, and this is the internal contradiction that's present in so many of these things, right?
I think I agree with as far as the cult examples you brought up. I wonder if Hegesias would would care about that though.
Well, that's kind of where I was going is no, I don't think so. And I wonder, I feel like you would have a lot more to say about this line of thinking even than me, but like I kind of have this idea that like the kind of society we live in now where we have like social media and like you have this, this simulacrum, right? Of like, my online personality and I kind of create this identity that is artificial and it's more real than me. This is like a thing that we
Oh,
have now. Like I don't know that that was really present in ancient Greece.
it is kind of though.
Yeah.
So Plato was very skeptical of the written word because he was worried that it doesn't really capture things as they are, but kind of like a repository of things or like a like kind of pseudo thing. And I wonder if he's getting that something kind of like that. Because he also was very against art for a similar way. Like it's like an imitation of the thing, but it's not the thing itself. And
Hmm.
it's not exactly the same, right? Like he's not thinking of it in terms of like, oh, there's like an artificial presence or humanity being created. But he is getting that like something about art and tragedy and writing is like a mask for us to hide behind and not like us being and engaging in person. That's why he likes the dialectic because it's like
Uh-huh.
to like stand by your words and engage right there. Like you can't hide behind anything. There's no presentation. You answer the question or you don't.
So Plato had this idea that like once something was written down, it was kind of what like crystallized and couldn't be changed. Was that like kind of a
Yeah,
concern?
because once it's written down, it's dead. It doesn't but participate in becoming anymore.
Oh, so basically Plato was kind of a proto-Delusian in that respect.
I guess you could. I mean, you can literally read anything into Plato, but yeah, sure.
You could read anything into Deleuze. People do it all the time.
No, but I mean, he was just skeptical of like that kind of like hiding behind this character of art or this character of writing, like not being your true self in the moment.
So why did he write, didn't he write down what Socrates said? I mean, isn't he the author of the dialogues?
Yeah, but I mean, he's a nuanced thinker, right? So of course he's going to do something that's contradictory to what he's doing. He wouldn't be intelligent if he didn't.
Interesting that the mark of intellect is actually maybe being comfortable with being contradictory at times.
I mean, I think there's two kind of philosophers that kind of talk about, especially in ancient Greek philosophy, but even modern times. There's like orthodox ones, and then there's aporetic ones. And the ones that are aporetic and always opening to revise their ideas, and they're kind of using their philosophy as like a rough draft that they're thinking through. I'm cool with them. But the ones that are like, here's a system, and I'm just going to derive everything from that system, that's boring to me. I mean, there's value to it, but that's kind of like the dead writing that I think Plato was talking about. Plato's goal is to like recreate the dialectic in writing. That's why he always is shifting his ideas. He defends hedonism in a dialogue and then he rejects it later. Like he doesn't care. He has his own argument with the forms.
See, I love that. I feel like that way of thinking is very it's up until very recently, I would say is kind of antithetical to the way I've tended to go about doing things, like writing things and creating things. Like I'm very perfectionist, I'm very obsessive, I'm very worried about like, I put all this time and effort into making sure like something is perfect because it's like this idea of like once it's out there that's it. This is the final form. And I've always been aware of how unhelpful that is. And yet I until recently I haven't really been able to kind of break out of that. And it was actually when I started reading craft essays by Chuck Palahniuk. the author of Fight Club. And this is one of the big things he harps on is like he's really big on writing being a communal activity precisely because when you're writing something and you're sharing it like in utero, like as it's developing with people, it really becomes this developing and discovery process where like when you write something, you're not like you're not reporting what you already know. You're actually using writing as the process of discovering what you don't know yet. And I feel like those are two very different approaches to writing, writing as reportage and writing as discovery. And I've been trying to kind of implement that, like just in my life, like in the stuff I do. And it's, I feel like I'm much more productive when I'm not as obsessed about like making something perfect. Like, because ironically, when you're a perfectionist, you don't get anything done. That's like the great irony of perfectionism.
Well, there's also no perfection. So you gotta be more like a Don Quixote figure. If you're gonna be a perfectionist, you gotta have these wild ideas and just kind of go for them despite the consequences.
So do you think Hegesias was more Don Quixote?
Well, we don't have that much from him, so I have no clue. But I think he was just kind of like a rationalist. Like he had these axioms, he had his experience, and he tried to derive the consequences from them. So to me, he's kind of like a very, even though he has he's like almost like this, like in my head, he's like this kind of bookish mathematician who kind of just like derives this extreme conclusion, but like you wouldn't imagine it if you talked to him on the streets.
Hmm.
That's my conception of it. And that's why I think he's kind of a weird character overall.
Well, what do you think we can learn from someone like Hegesias, like in like modern times? Like, do you see any Hegesiac renaissance up ahead?
Well, we already see it with the anti-natalist stuff. Like they're literally using the same arguments as him. Like they're hedonists that have turned hedonism into this kind of death cult in a way. Um, I think we need to be cautionary about it, honestly, because I don't know that, as much as like I have a proclivity toward anti-natalism in my head, I think there's something wrong with it. Because I just don't know, like, you know, you can do a chart about the value of life and you can try to map it out, but the only thing that gives life meaning is the person who's experiencing it. And there's no amount of data I think that can supplement that deep down. So, I don't want to have kids for whatever reason, but like I also realize that that's partly a bias on my part because I didn't have the full life that I want. But would I kill myself? No. So then maybe like why wouldn't I have kids then? You don't know. It's all about the value you give to the life.
Would that make you more of an aphoretic philosopher or the other kind?
I mean, I think I'm aphoretic, but you don't know until you're dead. I mean, I just don't like assessing the things that I do.
That's probably good. Yeah. Yeah,
I try to be though. I try to be. So I posted in the Discord. There's a section from Nietzsche I think is relevant to this too. I think if we read through it real quick, it might be interesting.
is this gay science?
No, this is Dawn of Day. It's called The Morality of Voluntary Suffering.
I see it. Do you want me to read it or
Yeah, go ahead. I'll read the next paragraph. I'll give you
okay.
the long paragraph.
Okay, this is section 18 from Dawn of Day by Nietzsche. The morality of voluntary suffering. What is the highest enjoyment for men living in a state of war in a small community, the existence of which is continually threatened, and the morality of which is the strictest possible? i.e., for souls which are vigorous, vindictive, malicious, full of suspicion, ready to face the direst events, hardened by privation and morality. The enjoyment of cruelty, just as in such souls and in such circumstances it would be regarded as a virtue to be ingenious and insatiable in cruelty. Such a community would find its delight in performing cruel deeds, casting aside for once the gloom of constant anxiety and precaution. Cruelty is one of the most ancient enjoyments at their festivities. As a consequence, it is believed that the gods likewise are pleased by the sight of cruelty and rejoice at it. And in this way, the belief is spread that voluntary suffering, self chosen martyrdom, has a high signification and value of its own. In the community, custom gradually brings about a practice in conformity with this belief. Henceforward, people become more suspicious of all exuberant well being and more confident as they find themselves in a state of great pain. They think that the gods may be unfavorable to them on account of happiness and favorable on account of pain, not compassionate. For compassion is looked upon with contempt and unworthy of a strong and awe inspiring soul, but agreeable to them because the sight of human suffering put these gods into good humor and makes them feel powerful, and a cruel mind revels in the sensation of power. It was thus that the most moral man of the community was considered as such by virtue of his frequent suffering, privation, laborious existence, and cruel mortification, not, to repeat it again and again, as a means of discipline or self-control or a desire for individual happiness, but as a virtue which renders the evil gods well disposed towards the community, a virtue which, oh no, I backspaced and now I'm lost.
A virtue
Sorry.
which continually wafts up to them the odor of expiatory sacrifice. All those intellectual leaders of the nations who reached the point of being able to stir up the sluggish, though prolific mire of their customs, had to possess this factor of voluntary martyrdom as well as insanity in order to obtain belief. Especially above all, as is always the case, belief in themselves. The more their minds followed new paths and were consequently tormented by pricks of conscience, the more cruelty they battled against their own flesh, their own desire, their own health, as if they were offering the gods a compensation and pleasure, lest these gods should wax wroth at the neglect of ancient customs and setting up of new aims. Let no one be too hasty in thinking that we are now entirely freed ourselves of the logic of such feeling. Let the most heroic souls among us question themselves on this very point. The least step forward in the domain of free thought and individual life has been achieved in all ages to the accompaniment of physical and intellectual torture. And not only the mere step forward, no, but every form of movement and change has rendered necessary innumerable martyrs throughout the entire course of thousands of years which sought their path and laid down their foundation stones. Years, however, which we do not think of when we speak of world history, that ridiculously small division of mankind's existence. And even in this so-called world history, which in the main is merely a great deal of noise about the latest novelties, there's no more important theme than the old tragedy of the martyrs who tried to move the mire. Nothing can be more dearly bought than the minute portion of human reason and feeling of liberty upon which we now pride ourselves. But it's this very pride which makes it almost impossible for us today to be conscious of the enormous lapse of time proceeding from the period of world history when morality of custom held the field, and to consider this lapse of time as the real and decisive epoch that established the character of mankind, an epoch when suffering was considered as a virtue, cruelty as a virtue, hypocrisy as a virtue, revenge as a virtue, and the denial of reason as a virtue. Whereas, on the other hand, well being was regarded as a danger, longing for knowledge as a danger, peace as a danger, compassion as a danger. An epoch when being pitied was looked upon as an insult, work as an insult, madness as a divine attribute, and every kind of change as immoral and pregnant with ruin. You imagine that all this has changed, and that humanity must likewise have changed its character. Oh, you poor psychologists, learn to know yourselves better.
Well, that last line seems like it's directed right at me, not the psychologist part, but you imagine that all this has changed and that humanity must likewise have changed its character.
Yeah.
Going back to what I was saying about like, oh, well, now we've got like Facebook and Twitter and all this social media, and that's why people take extreme views, and maybe they didn't have that back in ancient Greece. Maybe seems like Nietzsche might disagree.
Yeah, I think that's explicitly, but that's why I brought this up. Because I had just read this and I was thinking, like, this is kind of pertinent to what we're talking about.
It
But
also makes me wonder if maybe next time either going deeper into this passage or bringing in Schopenhauer's views on asceticism, which is a topic that I think kind of is interesting too. Like, where Nietzsche's talking about earlier on, where he's talking about where is it? Kind of this idea of like that martyrdom, this book, the belief is spread that voluntary suffering, self-chosen martyrdom has a value of its own.
mhm.
I mean, that's I mean, Schopenhauer, I don't think thought it had a value of its own. I think he thought asceticism was a means to an end, that end being basically realizing his ultimate moral principle, which is basically this universal feeling of love for your fellow man, which is usually not the first thing most people probably think about if they just know like a drive-by version of Schopenhauer, you know.
Right. Yeah, we could talk about that. Um, yeah, I think the Schopenhauer stuff is interesting. This is interesting too, because we didn't really get into this kind of view, but the idea is kind of like a evolutionary one where it's like, well, people in their natural, so to speak, state, pre-civilization, are prone to worship cruelty. Um, well, what's the consequence when you start to add things like gods into your ideology? Well, self cruelty, acts of cruelty against yourself, voluntary cruelty. These things start to become like not spawned out of your like base desires, but out of your idea that like, oh, a god likes to see suffering. So why wouldn't I just make myself suffer if I want the gods to be pleased by me? Right.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that um I think one of the reasons I bring up Schopenhauer is because I think he's sort of an exemplary case of a misunderstanding of asceticism, that like asceticism is primarily motivated by a desire for pain rather than as a means to an end. Like I think Schopenhauer saw it as a means to an end insofar as he thought it could help actualize the kind of moral philosophy he was after. But in doing so, he kind of focused on like sort of a perversion of what asceticism is really about. Like the way he talks about asceticism in, I think it's chapter 68 of, it's either 67 or 68 of World as Will, where he really talks about asceticism. And like when I read that for the first time, like having read a lot of ascetic writings, like my main thought was like there are so many ascetics that I've read that would disagree with the way he's describing what they're doing. Like they
Mhm.
would say he's focusing too much on the misery as like an end in itself, when like ultimately it's more of like I mean there's a number of ways to characterize asceticism, but I think one way of characterizing it that Schopenhauer kind of misses is it's like there it's like God, like union with the divine, or like emancipation from the samsara, depending on which side of the world we're looking at, is the goal, and self-mortification is the means.
So maybe this would be good to expand on next time because
Yeah.
it's like its own rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in reading that chapter with Schopenhauer and then comparing it to maybe aesthetic writing that we could look at.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a few specific ascetics that he draws on in that chapter too, which would be good. Like gives us a nice little his bibliography. which was kind of limited. So, which is good and bad, I guess.
Yeah, but overall, I'm happy with this discussion.